Such a huge introduction, and I hope I will not disappoint you. Ramji and I discussed about, first, our concern was about methodology itself. How do we read our materials? Although materials are not really ours, they are objectively out there. But the materials that we are closer to, that is what happens with the cultural artifacts and the philosophies that we are trained and we are raised in. And I was informally discussing upon it before I touch upon imagination. I was discussing the need for a shifted paradigm, not just for the West, but also for the East, for India. Shifted in what sense? I have sensed a growing chasm between the modernists and the traditional scholars. If you are trained in Sanskrit, maybe if you go to Sanskrit gurukulas or universities, you may be thinking of a flag bearer of the culture and performing some rituals for individuals or temples. And very few people think that if you are, like I have studied Tattva Chintamani with great passion with my teachers, and of course also Tantras, Tantric philosophies. And the only time, or maybe say mostly, if anybody from my community ever bothers talking to me, is if there is any puja happening in my house, or if I could conduct any puja for them. This is sad. For me, it is very sad. Because who is Gangesha Upadhyaya? Who is Gadadhar Bhattacharya? Who is Jagadisha Tarkalankara? Who is Vachaspati Mishra? If I read Immanuel Kant and Heidegger on one side and start reading Gadadhar Bhattacharya on the other side, I can't compare. You know why? Because Gadadhara is more rational and more scientific and more logical than any of these people. And who is to blame? People like us who are consciously choosing to not pay attention to this depth. But then when we are actually spending so much energy, not expecting resources, not running into how to make more money or be powerful, but are devoting our life for Mother Saraswati, we face another problem, is how to make these ideas globally known. Because today it is not sufficient just to know. We have to also think about how can these ideas reach out to the people who are going to appreciate it. So the challenge is not mine. The challenge is not purely Ramji's either. This is a collective challenge, and I may not be able to share that in this emotional way to everybody in every platform. And I hope you can feel how much home I'm feeling in this process of sharing exactly what hurts me, even to start the conversation. I'm just struggling. I never went to English school, unlike many of you. I just picked it on the way. and actually didn't have, except for sitting in classes of some philosophy professors here, I didn't have any formal training in Western philosophy. But I know my gurus raised me to be completely open-minded, to learn from every sources that we can. And you have to grow like a swan. You need to know what to ingest and what not. That comes from viveka, the insight to discriminate, to distinguish what is hygienic and what is not. Now, this tendency of rethinking can take in any field, in psychology, philosophy, cognitive science, to name a few, but if our masses are ready, we can start rethinking our own economic philosophy, our own political philosophy, our own we need to think. This morning at 3, I woke up and I was writing the philosophy of Hindu philosophy of biology. Why cannot? Why should we not write the philosophy of biology? Because we have not written anything about it now. In the modern world, Sushruta wrote his philosophy. You can read Sushruta, you can read Charaka, but then we can't just sit and translate the book. These are the conversations that are not going to find any conclusion today, but I just wanted to draw your attention that that is the main issue here. We had to talk on one topic. That's why imagination we chose. The best of the imaginations, I like it to start from a verse. I sometimes, still hear buzzing sound of my teacher singing this song. How moronic it is! Like if I translate it, Esh bandhya suto yati sasa sringa dhanurdhara kurma chira chaye snata Khapushpakrita Shekharaha. Oh, look at this gentleman, the son of a barren woman. He has come carrying the bow made out of the horn of a rabbit. He has bathed into the pond of the milk of a tortoise. And he's wearing the sky flowers. We can't really imagine even to, how to comprehend the son of a barren woman. The statement is paradoxical. If she's barren, she couldn't have a son. If rabbit couldn't have a horn, if tortoise couldn't give milk, there are no flowers blooming in the sky. When we think of imagination, emotion, these are the topics that the West has shunned for a long time, and maybe only in the wake of 21st century that serious philosophers have started working. I know that there have been some works in the later 20th century, some really good phenomenology and existential phenomenology on imagination, but not as much as they could have worked on. And even the early workers like Vico, Coleridge, like Ramji said, at the purpose of going to poetic imagination and not actually engaging imagination as a productive or a topic for our scientific investigation or rational logical inquiry, as chapter of philosophy. So thinking through imagination, why I think it is necessary, I could go to, Sartre and Abhinavagupta and make it more scholarly. I'm feeling a little laxed here among my brothers. Because I don't need to do that. I think I will share my articles with you guys. I want to just have a little conversation today. So what has been the attitude when I read broadly Hindu literature and mostly philosophical literature? What type of tendency I see when addressing imagination? That is the question. Do I see a fundamental cultural shift or a gap in addressing this issue? So read for imagination, our word would be what? Kalpana, right? Kalpana, we would call kalpana. Surya Chandramasau Dhata Yatha Purvama Kalpayat. Now we will go to the Vedic text earliest, then we start digging out where these words come in which context. And so one thing that should startle everybody is this word kripu, derived from kripu, is kalpana, has worked historically for construction as well as imagination, for real making. Kalpayati. So the kalpayati is not fantasized. The time that we call kalpa is not just a fantasy. So this is actual making and also imagining. Creation in the mind of Brahma is actual, real, and also imaginary. So to imagine is not to just the way we treat fantasy. Immediately when I say fantasy consciousness, I'm so used to using the word, and many of my Western audience believe this is a sort of fantastic, means absolutely nothing to do with reality. This tendency is there in our analysis, like I mentioned, Gangesh Upadhyay, for example. And if you read Nirvikalpaka Vada, for example, you are going to find the analysis of pure intuitive knowledge. You can go for that tendency way earlier. Kalpana Podam Abhrantam Pratyaksham, Kalpana Podam Pratyaksham in Dignaga, 4th century Buddhist philosopher, you are going to find in Dignaga. A sort of curbing, washing off fantasy or imagination in order to actually get access to what is valid, what is veridical. So veridical consciousness comes in contrast to the imaginary since like very early times, and rightfully so. And that is why I add one more, that is why Indian philosophers have broadly rejected memory to be any valid means of knowledge, prama, yathartha jnanam. Why? Because in memory, they somehow sensed a sort of infiltration of imagination. So I'm not saying that imagination can be left unchecked, because then we'll be making another stereotype that, okay, Indian philosophy fails to make a distinction between veridical knowledge and imaginary knowledge. No, this is quite the other way. But Indian philosophy is well aware of how to curve to go to intuitively given. But at the same time, it's not about the metaphysics of the imagination. It's not about doing pure phenomenology of the imagination only. There is something more to it. What is yathartha? Yathartha as it is, for reality, our term is yathartha, right? So what is yathartha? For most Indian philosophers, for something to be yathartha, it has to be artha kriyakari. It needs to have causal efficiency. So something that can bear fruit for real is real. So therefore, something you see in a dream, you could not bear its result. You won a lottery in a dream and you don't have money, you wake up. So it's not real. It doesn't have the causal efficiency. Someone stabbed you in the dream, you are not wounded when you wake up. So therefore, it is not real. You imagine something, and it's still, you imagined someone you quarreled with, you imagine him dead, and he's still walking. Therefore, your fantasy is not real. So therefore, yes. But what type of causal efficiency? Is there any causal efficiency possible? That is where I'm bringing imagination, because we are not, I'm not doing just analytical philosophy here, because philosophy needs to go beyond just being armchair conversation. It was never the case in the case of India, because why people did philosophy? To transform their life. It's not to talk something very intelligently. It's not to have debate as a spectacle. It is to transform one's own life, transform society. Philosophies for us have this capacity to change our horizon, darsana, immediate encounter to the truth, that makes us humble to give insight of this magnificent, overwhelming reality. In the case of, when talking imagination, in the case of the imagination, now the point comes that we have viewed the imagination the same way that the imagination also has a causal efficiency. What type of causal efficiency? So it's not even about, does imagination bear a mere semblance of reality? It's more about how can imagination enrich and actually magnify what we see as real, to give our very perception of reality meaning, power, potency. And this is where we have to go yet again to trace some historical texts, pratyavijna in particular, recognition. When you consider recognition as in itself a veridical knowledge, a pramana. What is recognition? Let me briefly mention it. You cognize every day, you have a first-hand consciousness, that is cognition. But then when you cognize again, when you go to the same campus, when you go to the same classroom, when you see the same faces of your students that you had seen yesterday, you recognize the room, you recognize the students. If we say that only the new information is what amounts to pramana, then our everyday consciousness may not have that newness, because we are repeatedly seeing the same persons. But what type of, in those cases too, what type of newness is there, if at all, is where we can find that addressed is in the concept of pratyavijna, recognition. In recognition, we have two different modes of consciousness assembled together. One is, of course, memory. I saw Ramji and now I'm seeing him again. So this is a memory there. But then I am seeing him now. That is the part, that is where my current perception works. There is the perception combined with memory, integrally called pratyavijna, recognition. In this pratyavijna, if we start analyzing the layers of this consciousness, what we come up with is we see that my current perception of something is enriched with the nuances borrowed from the past. So I may not pay total attention to the friends that come here every day I hang out with. And if it was somebody totally new, then maybe I would be more attentive. My sensory faculty is more engaged in taking snapshots, making ideas about the person. So when we are borrowing and blending inputs from the past, there is also a possibility. We may also see something vivified, magnified in counterfactual imagining or hypothetically placed situation. We all daydream in one way or the other, in to some extent. In those fantasy situations, there is the subject given now and the fantasy subject which is not real. But the fantasy subject is not just a memory product. It's not a product of memory alone. There is something you don't have to remember. It's in fantasy, it's something completely new is added. But what does that fantasy do in this blended consciousness is when you are able to think of yourself being in a particular situation, when you are able to place yourself on others' shoes, look through others' eyes, when you are able to think about yourself for yourself, how others might be evaluating, judging, it gives us intersubjective knowledge about ourselves and our reality. It places us in the shared domain, our social domain, and we become intersubjective subjects, persons, ourselves. And then that assessment would not be guided purely based on memory if we were not to use imagination as a proper mode of knowledge. Then we may not see ourselves down the line 10 years in the future, because all those plannings we do about our lives cannot be solely controlled by memory and painful things that happen, therefore I want to avoid it. No, life is very miserable if you think that way. Life is fun if you think that I am thinking 10 years down the line, I want to find myself in this situation, and that is why there is a huge projection. When you think of yourself solely guided by memory, because memory is imprinted in our body, our cells, we can completely say that there is no free will, or there is no subjects or minds control over the matter, because it's a memory can be analyzed solely on materialistic background. But when we start giving not even primacy, some concession to fantasy, some concession to imagination and how it works, then we are creating a new environment that we have not experienced before, could not be borrowed from our memory. But then those situations that we project ourselves onto forbid us from doing bad things, like not stealing, for example, or not behaving like animals. And because we place ourselves in these potential humiliating situations and then we stop doing that. Look at how much creative potential imagination has. And why do I think that contemplative traditions, I'm broadly saying for any meditative practices, can actually give us a way out for not just addressing a sort of brute philosophy for a analytical discourse, but actually giving us a way, an educational tool for educating our own self or subject by means, by aid of imagination, and as well as being ourselves active in this intersubjectively shared domain in which we all have to imagine others' feelings, others' times, others' spaces, others' sensibilities. And that is, these are the things we could not attribute entirely to memory. Therefore, imagination actually has a bigger role in active role to play. It's one chapter. The other chapter is if we want to address imagination, what type of materials we can encounter. The big book we discussed last year was Yoga Vashishta through Vimarsa. Yoga Vashishta is, I think, the most magnificent philosophy book, has not even properly studied. I can't get even a reliable translation for the book. Forget about it. Even the editions are not really the best shape. But anyway, they are all useful. And we can get the gist out of it even through translation. If you read in Sanskrit, that is much better. This voluminous work, the Yoga Vasishta, many people will think of some fantasy stories, but if you start reading the way the philosophies are woven into the fabric of these narratives, then we come to a completely new philosophy of the imagination in the Yoga Vasishta. If you want to go a much earlier text, then I would recommend the Gaudapada Karikas, the work of Gaudapada, his commentary upon Mandukya Upanishad, is like a Vartika he wrote, and then the commentaries upon that, because that's a substantial use of kalpana to analyze consciousness in its constitutive role. What does kalpana have to do with consciousness? Because it's inherent to what is inherent to consciousness is the primary domain of consciousness is to imagine. So just Deva, this very self, imagines, kalpayati, and that is how it constitutes a reality. Gaudapada goes on and on and on. So in these accounts of when I read Mandukya Karika or Yoga Vasishta, what type of imagination I find is more still in analytical type, not mining imagination. The process of mining imagination I find more in almost like a therapeutic context of like Abhinava Gupta's work, or even in the yoga, the way they use. Now, practically speaking, many of us have lived through one or another trauma. Many people in our society are living through trauma and psychological disorders. Why do we have psychological disorders? Because of imagination. I call this the hygienics of imagination, because its monsters are real when you think they are real, because they will do the same thing as monsters do. They can scare you the hell. That's all they have to do. But having fear is such thing that you do not need a real object to constitute real fear. Real fears can be constituted by unreal objects. That is where reality stops making sense. That is where imagination is as real as anything else. When we enter the domain of the mind, because we have a huge reality of the domain of the mind, our mental health is a big issue, and there is a forecast that in America, every 1 out of 2 is 50 and above is going to have one or another mental disorder, and that is that is really scary. Crazy people with guns. Okay, so it's not a fun place to be around. So mental. How do we use imagination? Let's say why I'm talking about the different type of reality of the imagination is, let me negate Ramji, like a friend of Ram says, oh, Ram didn't show up today. If you have a statement, Ram didn't show up today. Now, when you are sharing that information with your friends, what is being conveyed is the absence, non-being of Ram. But this negation of Ram is not giving you, because there are no negative facts. You could not be describing negative facts. But when you are saying, I can't see Ram anywhere, Ram is nowhere to be found, you have the image of Ram in your head. Still, right? When we are negating things, even the things that we are negating, we are giving presence in our mind. And even for completely impossible things, like round squares, for example, if it is round, it is not a square. That's the basic idea. Round squares. When I say round squares don't exist, I'm simply stating the fact. But don't ask me what a fact it is, because fact should be about describing things that are there. I mean, there are no round squares. I'm saying round squares don't exist. So you have these mental objects. When I am talking about round squares, mind may be making something circular or something square shaped, and there may be not a clear cut image of any of that, but still some type of image is still giving the presence, like my consciousness still brings to its fore something as an object. It's not a direct correspondence. That's not how it works. But for the mind, it constitutes something to be a corresponding entity for our conversation, what we are talking about. So in this conversation of completely non-existent objects, if we see imagination already enriching our consciousness, then what we find is like imagination is always filling the lacuna wherever it can to give us a complete picture of whatever the thing we are discussing about. And we need to read imagination as this creative surge inherent to consciousness that we can only find in the concepts like of the philosophers like Abhinavagupta, when they talk about pratibha. What is pratibha? Pratibha is this creativity or this intuitive flash or this reflexivity of consciousness, vimarsha, pratyavamarsa. In this, what do we have is nitya nava navonmeshata, a constant newness, that there is always something new appearing. That is what constitutes consciousness. That is where we find ourselves present. Our being present implies doing something new. And if we are doing something new, that makes us very much alive. And we do not expect machines to do something completely new. Like, if you have this clock and then goes from 1 to 12, and one day it went from 1 to 14, we don't imagine like that, because that's not how it works. I don't expect my car parked outside just to, go on its own somewhere. Because we don't expect any random unexpectedness from machines. We expect that random unexpectedness from conscious subjects. That is where we express our freedom. We may not always do that. It is not necessary that we always enjoy our freedom or are capable of enjoying our freedom, but at the moment when we are capable of enjoying our freedom, at the moment when we are able to express our freedom, we create. Mentally or physically, we are creative. And in that creativity, what works with us is imagination. Even for scientific creativity, it is not just a poetic creativity. To be creative implies to have a new vision. You can mix up the same thing. You know, when you invite me as a guest and make new food, you don't need to get completely new grocery, like non-hoard, never seen fruits and vegetables. But it's always the mixing of the same existing ingredients. You don't need to always get a unique ingredient to create something completely new. So the same way we are thinking in the same terms, we have the same vocabulary, more or less all these words give the same meaning. One person ends up creating poetry, another philosophy. That is where our creativity lies. And this creativity is possible only when imagination is allowed to unfold, to express itself. There is this imaginary power of imagination. And that power of imagination makes us creative and co-creative in the sense that if this world is already created in these huge mechanical, chemical processes, then we are co-creative in, intuitively adding a nuance and making it something new. Therefore, imagination has this tremendous capacity. How it is used, I will give you one example from the ritual paradigm, because I hope modern educated people are not as repelled of the idea of talking about rituals. I'm a very thorough ritualist. If you have, of course, that is not very respectful to say, if you have seen Hindu rituals, of course you have seen Hindu rituals. What happens then is there is this imaginary space created by drawings, This is the mandala. There is a new sacred space created. That is why the issue of which is a holy site was never a problem for the Hindus. They could make it anytime they like. You just make a diagram, make a mandala, and then now it is a holy site. But then, is it going to be always a holy site? Nobody should touch. You just wash it off, wipe out, and then it is a secular site. Then it is not real. Or that is your very dogmatic way of thinking about reality, completely incapable of constituting the sacred. The sacred space is your construction. You have the power to create the sacred. Think of the images. I love this image. Why many people suggested, my colleagues say, Sthaneshwar, you have to at one point give up the idea of writing a book on images, because nobody is going to read it and it may not even give you a tenure. And then I'm like, but I have to do it. And why do you have to do it? Because nobody else is ever going to do this thing. Therefore, I have to do it. So it's quite possible. But why I was so intrigued is like, so many hands and so many heads and so many weapons and so many vehicles. And most of the Westerners are mortified. Oh my gosh, these gods with the monstrous heads and, carrying weapons and very scared. And they anyway like to see something to talk negatively about these things, as if giving. Nobody is going to even make an attempt to understand. These people were consciously, meticulously creating, merging, blending images from different inputs, and they're refining practices of meditation, creating new objects of meditation, and so that is what we find in not just the external ritual, but also internal ritual. So I am sure that if somebody has actually performed any of the Hindu ritual, you can go and ask the priest that they may have substituted like this grass called kusha as a substitution for the gold. How on earth that priceless grass substitute the gold? Gold is pricey, and so. And I asked the priest, how can you substitute the gold with this grass? Now, I have literally done that. Panditji, can I offer this grass to you? And then, because I grow the little grass in my backyard, and the priests here get like really crazy because they don't have it growing in the temple, And then when I go with the kusha grass, they feel so rich. Oh my gosh, we have kusha now. It's a cultural value. This value is possible only by means of imagination. When you take out imagination, it turns into just pure grass, no useful, not even like a weed grass. In America, they smoke ganja, Kusha grass, you can't even smoke. It's useless totally. So therefore, look at the power of imagination in constituting and altering, transforming reality, and how that interacts to our own mental hygiene. That is where we start seeing about subverting. Sometimes we even subvert what is the external and transform our own subjective horizon, our own what am I to you, or this is imagination. This is like I now, if you go to the marriage in the West, a guy says, and I now pronounce you husband and wife, and now you are husband and wife. I mean, is that real? Like when you become, if I hope many of you have become husband, and there is no extra body parts growing by becoming husband or wife. So this is our whole social structure is maintained by healthy imagination. There is this a huge input for all our social structures, our family structures that are regulated by imagination, rather than thinking about to what extent imagination is very difficult. Better way would be, how can we mine this imagination to give us only wholesome imagination and not the negative imagination. People who have come from the war zone, people who have witnessed their friends killed, people who have lost their own limbs, people who are living in, come out of violence, family violence. When I sometimes when students talk about hardship, I say, if you guys had been to even one fraction of what I went through, you would be, calling for handicapped pension. Because like I showed them without shame my head, the day like I decided to leave the country, when the Maoists, communists attacked, they wanted us to not teach Sanskrit. And I'm like, what am I going to do then? Am I going to just go and work in gas station? I was a lecturer, and I was assaulted in the classroom by the Maoists. And so I was knocked unconscious. I gained my consciousness, and then I started working the next day, because these things should not. If you use your power of imagination, that is why I like to bring imagination, not just for the sake of philosophy, but for the sake of our health, for the sake of our transformation in how in yogas use imagination as a capacity to build holistic life. So this is where our philosophies can add more. And that is almost like Western philosophers don't even want to talk about, because for them, the task of philosophy has gone slightly to different direction, in which I don't even need philosophy, because if all they want to do is talk about what physics has told us, then I would rather just read physics. I don't need to be reinterpreted the same theories of the physicists by the mouth of not so educated physicists, like a philosopher, I mean, who have very little training in physics, and they want to tell us their worldview. And if you boil down all they are talking about, it just boils down to pure physics. Then there is nothing higher, above and beyond what the physics cannot tell us about. So if there is anything that can teach us beyond physics, I think the philosophy of imagination could be one of those subjects that we should take a serious note to. And I would like to give you guys a chance to have some questions and conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Acharya ji. It was very nice. It was very interesting to hear about imagination. It reminded me of a book that I read. This one is by Lisa Feldman Barrett. It's called How Our Emotions Are Made. Maybe you have come across this book. So she talks about the fact that we are always generally imagining something, and we generally act before we actually think we act. So we are in a way. I mean, this is something neuroscientists I think are now discovering, that we're always living an imagined sort of reality, if I understand correctly. So I see that in the West now there seems to be like a bridging of a gap between what science or neuroscience is saying and what artists talk about. What would you like to say about that?
I would rather like to have this gap, widen than to be reduced, because there are some art philosophers who are actually talking in the lines of the physics, and all these new experiments of postmodernism and post-structural ways also could not give us as much in the horizon of imagination. Two things I would like to add. One on emotion and imagination, really important for our, like emotion is another topic that so-called pure philosophers do not want to talk about, because it's irrational. Emotion makes it irrational, makes us do irrational things. Imagination is the same way. So these are like taboo, and that is where we can start, So if we can pick up the pieces from there. But not just that, because these two things guide so much. It's so crucial. Who am I? My core of being is composed of my emotions and my fantasies. Like when I think of all the past, I don't need to walk through the journey of every event that happened to me, but the accreted emotion. And when I think of who I am, my imagination, how I place myself in front of my friends and peers and my students and my teachers. So imagination is a new area. I mean, like there's some work, but I think that we may add, like even I myself am trying to have some conversation with the cognitive scientist in some of my works, and also given some papers with some psychiatrists and cognitive scientists. We do need to use to some extent their language, but I myself am very cautious to not reduce my materials into their philosophy. What do I mean is that I'm using language as a means of communication with them, because when we communicate, if we do not communicate, our ideas are going to be lost. But and we cannot communicate in a language that is not acceptable to both the parties. That's a kind of given in any mode of communication. And cognitive science is also a language to talk about particular issues, and so we should equip ourselves with the language, and to some extent, some categories, or cautiously taking what can be acceptable. But beyond that, we also need to be mindful that we are not meant to end up being a reproduction of already chewed on Western philosophies and Western sciences. And because if we try to do that, then we can do that. I'm not saying we should not. We have the right to do so, but we will not be able to give something original, because at the end of the day, originality is what is at stake. And we can use the language, but if we read our materials in light of this language, then we might actually have a chance of getting some original scholarship done. Again, mining. I'm interested not on the facts. I'm interested in how can we use this fact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
first of all, thank you very much, Acharya ji. So I was just wondering, as you mentioned in the beginning, that imagination is at the core. You mentioned that Surya Chandrama Saudhata Yatha Purvam Akalpayat. So I was just want to know what is this nature of this imagination. For example, earlier when this starts, it starts with the Ritancha Satyan Chabhi Tapasa Adhyajayat. So what is the nature of this tapas? Is this the intense contemplation or imagination, or is this a very transitive sort of action from the absolute reality?
There are many ways to read this. The Vedic mantras are very cryptic, and we can never expunge meaning out of it in totality. But my own inspiration at the moment goes to, in a more metaphysical sense, that number one, unlike what they mean by consciousness, what we mean by Chaitanya Chit is the foundation, the basis. That is not a byproduct of the chemical processes, but that is the constant, that is the basis upon which all the visible structures and metaphysical and physical realities appear. So this is one thing we need to keep in mind trying to read these kind of passages. And two is this consciousness is always creative. Unlike later, post Shankara, when we think of consciousness more into passive mode, when the more I read Vedic texts or Upanishads themselves, I find consciousness more dynamic. And so in this dynamism, I'm trying to read consciousness's dynamism in this Kalpayat. It creates now what they say, modern physicists, of course, they don't have pure science, but the hypothesis is that everything is spinning in the world, and then it's going to go to entropy, and maybe going to take, we don't know how long, maybe 40 billion light years, or give an enormous time, and then everything will go to inertia, and then in the absolute zero, like when there is no heat at all, then there won't be any energy emitted, and then the world would be dead. It is the heat of consciousness itself that it regenerates. That is where modern physics is not thinking through that generation and regeneration are eternal processes. And that is when we can see Ritam Satyam So this coming of the night, and all those passages we can explain on this type of new physics, where we have to shift the foundation to consciousness as the primary, and then it will have that autonomy to self-heat. And then when the self-heat begins, then temporality can be expressed and the events can occur and creation is possible. And that is the way I'm reading this. Thank you.
So my question, Acharya, is where is the boundary between hallucination and imagination? How do we come to know whether we are hallucinating, like negative imagination is happening, or something very constructively taking us for transformation? Do we have like clear guidance in our scriptures to use that for both purposes?
This is the most important issue, actually. If our friends like to, I will, Ramji, email you meditation and imagination paper that was published, I think, last year. And that is where I'm engaging some of the contemporary cognitive scientists about how imagination is used in meditation. That the first thing when I kind of presented imagination in a very flowery, rosy picture, it is not that then therefore go haywire in imagination. They have these dictated, mandated rules of bhavana, which is again constitution and imagining. And so I analyze, in that particular paper, I analyze Abhinavagupta and Maheshwarananda, how they use imagination to create a ritual paradigm, and then how they transform day-to-day reality. So number one, most of our ritual observations require imagination, but that doesn't mean that any imagination is as good. And also, for random people who are imagining, you can let them do whatever they like. But people who are either very creative, powerful people, they can create their own monsters by the use of their consciousness. Our minds, if they are active, if you have a very active, vivid imagination, then making that vivid imagination positive is going to add quality to your life. But if that is unchecked, then that will be used for negative purposes, and that will go towards negative tendency, and that is detrimental to health. Therefore, these meditative practices are meticulous about how to use that. But there was a second part of your question on hallucination. In active imagination, a subject is always capable of walking out of it. In hallucination, we have this loss of our own subject. The object takes over, and it becomes more real than any real thing for us, or as real or any other real things for us. And that is where it becomes unhealthy, or it becomes detrimental to our mental health. So in hallucination, if I am hallucinating, I will not know at the time. That is the very definition of hallucination. If I'm hallucinating and I know I'm hallucinating, I may not be hallucinating. I can have erroneous perception. And then that is when I know that I'm having erroneous perception and the thing is not there, but I can still continue to see it as if it is there. But then in pure hallucination, we even have the loss of the self, the subject. We are brooded into it, walk out, then we are. So at the moment of hallucination, I don't think, at least right now, I don't have any way out. But imagination cannot lead you to hallucination, because imagination, on the contrary, adds you with a heightened subjective awareness to filter and process the concepts that come to your mind, to meticulously suspend some of the ideas from coming to the mind. When you are imagining Hanumanji, why do you have to think of Hanumanji having a monkey face? Why can't you think of Hanumanji having a donkey face? You don't do that. Okay, that is how you have in this. Just because you are imagining doesn't mean that you can just imagine whatever you like. So by guiding, that's what these meditative texts always give you, a particular image to think about. And most people say, if it is just an image, let me make my own. Yeah, you can. I mean, who is going to stop you? But I don't know the consequences of doing that, because that is just something walking into uncharted territory. Therefore, yes, there are these guidelines in the meditative text about how to develop, stages of higher and higher stages of imagination. Bhaskara Raya, a 16th century around Maratha Tantric philosopher, gives in his Yogini Hridayam commentary how to stack layers and layers and layers of imagination in a single space, going all the way up to 16-fold images playing at the same time, 16 processes. People were doing amazing things. The capacity to simultaneously process 16 different ideas. You can say, no, it is not possible. But if you, know these chess players who can play with 20 different people at the same time, like there's this Queen's Gambit, popular film came out this year. These people are able to process all the chess games at the same time, and then there's different persons are playing, but then one player is playing with all the persons at the same time. So the brain is processing all the different information at the same time. But that requires very higher level of attention matched with a sustained a course of imagination, where it's not a random thought, but rather a cultured thought, proper process of imagination. Thank you.
So can we categorize imagination also like from three gunas, like sattvic imagination, rajasic, or tamasic? Can it be applied?
That can be. I mean, not that there is a qualitative thing in this. There are two types of things in imagination or in fantasy or anything. One is its representational object. Another is the mode of consciousness. And then the third is the state in which we are having these modes of consciousness. So the state consciousness can be affected by sattva, raja, tama all the time. And that will make the same imagination good, bad, ugly. The same kind of things we think about. You may not based on when you are imagining. If it is like nighttime there, now I'm thinking about, this fresh lemon, you can mix with the hot chili pepper and then, a lot of salt and, have little, just a lemon only. And no, I'm not in the mood to have some lemon now, you would say that. Because, that's not something people would imagine at the time. So state consciousness is not evaluating the object of imagination the same way based on your mental state right now. Therefore, our state consciousness always determines. So as far as the object goes, it may not have sattva, raja, tama kind of inherent properties. If you are imagining a lemon, it's still the lemon, just the same. But your being in a particular state is what sattva, raja, tama, and then you want it now, because whatever you imagine now you want it. If it is rajas, if it is sattva, then you are going to be indifferent of the object coming to your imagination. If it is tamas, then it is going to repel you. You don't want to have that object. You have no orientation to you are passive, because tamas is what makes you passive. So you are going to remain passive. So your state consciousness will be guided by sattva, raja, tama, but not the object consciousness.
We are using imagination to access the higher reality that we cannot perceive through senses. Is that the right way to look at the role of imagination in our life?
We can use imagination as a mechanism to counter our biologically or culturally doomed mind, because even the escape is something we need to imagine. And then that is how imagination, the liberation texts are using imagination as telling you the world is imagination. You can always say the world is not imagination, fine. But what if the world is not imagination and I'm still considering it as imagination? What will that do is it will help me be indifferent to the world. The factuality of the world has nothing to do with you thinking the world is imagination. Because when you start thinking the world is imagination, it starts making you not as much obsessive of the things in the world as it otherwise could. So there is still how we can use imagination for higher self-realization processes is still relevant, whether or not everything imagination is. And at the end, you are using, because as I said, I would rather like to use imagination as a capacity of the mind for creating a reality that I want than just to talk about the factuality of imagination. So that type of creative capacity of imagination lies also in our self-liberating efforts. We can use imagination just the same way, and to free from our own ghosts. There is this beautiful story from Bengal. Do I have any friend from Bengal here? Bengal area, claim Bengal. Bengal is the greatest place to claim. from yeah, there was a guy called I think this history I may have mixed up though, Naropa, and he had a student coming from Tibet, Marpa, to learn tantra from him, and this Marpa has so little insight, analytical knowledge, because he was just a cowherd boy, and cannot process deep ideas. And one day Naropa is like thinks, okay, this kid is not going to get any teaching. I'm gonna teach him directly now. Okay, Marpa, think of your head, growing horns on your head, and then he just goes out, when later comes back to the cave, and then knocks the door. Marpa, open the door. Master, I cannot even move. What do you mean you cannot move? Oh, my horns block the wall and I cannot even move my head. And you see, this he had such a strong power of imagination for the horns that he was used to. You don't need to do deep philosophy. Now, Naropa says, okay, now then why not you start shrinking the size of the horns? And keep shrinking it, and then at the end, and Master, I don't have horns anymore. But why not you just also shrink your body and let it go? It's also imagination, like just let it go. The body, the mental body, even if you have the physical body, the body given to your mind is not that same physical body. Otherwise, you should never go to the doctor to know what is happening in your body. Your body is not transparent to your mind. You think it is, but it is not. So therefore, you are imagining a body even now. Whenever you think, I'm not imagining, it's real. That is your imagination. Otherwise, if you are having a real access to your body, you should not go for X-ray, or whatever, all the things. We don't have the knowledge of the real body. So the clinical body. We have the knowledge of the imagined body. We are used to this. That is why it feels very real. So anyway, going back to Marpa, now he says, Marpa, Master, I see all empty. Okay, good. You are enlightened. This is what enlightenment is. Your body, you had just imagined your body. Okay, now come open the door. Job done. So enlightenment is a process of liberating from all the fantasies. And if you can use one more fantasy to counter all the fantasies, so be it.
That is very illuminating, very interesting to hear. So our basic assumption is that this world is Maya. So you need a bigger imagination to come out of this Maya.
Yeah. we are so used to this, and it doesn't feel right to say Maya. And so therefore, and we are creating more and more and more other fantasies, stacking on top of this fantasy, and so you want to walk out of it, then you have to better use imagination for even walking out of it.
Yes, that is quite interesting to know. And there's last question. Sorry, that was second last. Now this one is the last. You have used the terminology deconstruction. Okay. And deconstruction is something that is very often used in Indian tradition for a spiritual purpose. But now deconstruction in the Western tradition is used something for different purpose. Of course, I know this is a very long topic, and maybe I'll request you to come again and talk about this. But just briefly, can you just make difference between the Western tradition of deconstruction and Indian tradition of deconstruction in the context of imagination?
So when we are deconstructing, my limited knowledge is, if you read Jacques Derrida, for example, the very famous guy, this is basically destruction, like the things, and you need to go to language and science and all those things for that. But I'm trying to just be very minimalistic. That there is one thing to deconstruct and all the categories and say there is absolutely nothing real. And are we projecting something, insinuating a different reality by means of deconstructing? Or is that deconstruction in itself a construction rather than destruction? So when we are using, mostly if you read in modern social discourses, people are using deconstruction as if being big scientists, social scientists, destroying existing categories may be needed because some categories become old and may not be useful for our social benefit. But then are we able to give a deeper insight and liberate society, liberate the minds by the mechanism? For us, it is always about liberation. Liberation is not metaphysical, spiritual only, though. It's not that all the Indian philosophers want to escape from the world as quickly as they can. They may better suicide. That is very gross misunderstanding of liberation. It's a freedom from misconceptions, and all the philosophies do want freedom from misconceptions. And in that sense, I agree, deconstruction, that we need freedom from misconceptions. But what I observe today in practice is many people are using this as a tool, a vandalism tool, or not even, I'm not even deconstructing false projections, but rather they have already a conceived notion of what reality should be like, and deploying deconstruction as a mechanism, as a method to assault on others' assumptions and others' beliefs and others' philosophies. So when you use deconstruction as a tool, as a weapon, not as a means to liberate yourself, that is not how we have used knowledge in India. For us, knowledge is not a weapon. And we do not use it as a perspective in order to destroy or reject reality, because our attitude has always been about using all the methods. It doesn't matter, because there is this foundational truth to it. When you go in this Western mode of deconstruction, there is no truth. Truth is merely the construction of power. So therefore, if you are more powerful, like if your chorus is louder, hooting, like when you have a more bigger crowd and hooting, then that is more powerful. This is like when we fragment, when we do not even conceive of the possibility of some underlying truths. And then we go to the quagmire. Some of the realities, what is happening in the modern West, contemporary West, is the media, for example. There is no media that I can trust to, nothing. Nobody is saying anything that I say I'm going to take on face value. BBC, are you kidding? CNN, are you really? I mean, Fox News, I mean, that's a joke. So this is where we go, because this is the consequence of really using deconstruction as a weapon and not having any foundational truth to aspire for. For me, there are foundational truths to aspire for. And that is how we can use deconstruction still as a creative mechanism and use imagination for that, rather than using a destructive tool to claim that will to power and know there is no truth, and that you can make anything true, because that to us is not acceptable, has not been. And eventually, if humanity has future, then we will have to get back to our senses. We will have to accept the parameters in which, even if socially constructed reality, that is still constructed, collectively constructed reality. You cannot, you can always reject our family relations do not exist. It is only accepting your wife and his wife. It is just the acceptance. But you know what? And then the society will go to chaos, and then you'll have to get back to your senses and still accept these social realities as reality, constructed fine. But again, creative. Therefore, we have to give power to the truth and not just destroy. It is easy to use tools of knowledge for destructive purposes, but we have the obligation as scholars to use these things very carefully. Pashupatastra was never used in the Mahabharata war. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. So we as scholars have a bigger obligation, moral obligation of what we should use our knowledge for. And that obligation lies for both ourselves and our society. Welfare, our own welfare and the welfare of the others, not destruction. We are using knowledge for destruction. That is a monkey business. That is not going to give happiness to anybody. We are trying to create the world more and more restless by our ideas. How damaging those ideas are. In these modern worlds, we have gotten so many ideas, the idea of racism, the communism, and all these new so-called amazing isms. So many people have died. Who is going to talk about it? Millions, I'm not talking about a couple people, died of some brutal, primitive man striking with his bone another neighbor, I'm talking about genocides. Genocides are happening because of our ideas. Genocides are not biologically given to us, not a necessity, but we are causing it because we have these ideas. So therefore, talking of deconstruction, I went a little far, that this is used as a weapon, and that is something we all need to be wary of. But doesn't mean that the very sciences of deconstruction are wrong or false. It is just that the users are monstrous.
I think very clear and profound differences you have laid out. Thank you for this answer. I think we have one more question. I think Sumatiji, you would like to go ahead.
Yes, I mean, it's a very deep topic for me, especially. So thank you very much, Acharya ji, for this enlightening talk. I'm still wrapping my mind around the topic. I just wanted to, when we were talking about this, one thing that came to my mind is the famous mathematician Srinivasan Ramanujan had said that he was, most of his equations did not have any proofs. When he sent them to Professor Hardy, I think Professor Hardy almost threw them away because he didn't see. And then he suddenly realized that, this couldn't have come out of somebody's imagination just like that unless there was something behind it. And Srinivasa Ramanujan claimed that at least his thing was that he was given these equations in his dreams by his goddess, the village goddess of Namagiri. So would something like this also fall under the purview of such an imagination? I don't know if the question is also rightly articulated. Would we call that? But it was in a dream state, I think. That is what he said.
Even a dream and imagination have a very healthy and bigger correlation. When I'm imagining, my consciousness, for many philosophers have equated with a dreaming mode of consciousness in the imagining mode of consciousness. So how did he do it? I do not know. Did the goddess manifest to him? I believe so, if he says so. But what is the mechanism behind it? He let it. It doesn't happen overnight, just when we think a goddess is going to come from my village and then reveal to me higher mathematical formula. Okay, that is not going to happen to me. So for that to happen, somebody has opened up for that possibility for a long sustained time. That is what is called yoga. That is what we call dhyan. So in this dhyan, he has allowed, first of all, beginning with imagination. Okay, my goddess there. Maybe the problems I cannot solve, maybe she can help. Then is it himself? Fine, because from the Vedanta perspective, everything is himself. There is this higher ego and the lower ego. His lower ego cannot solve the problem. Then he lets the higher ego unfold in the form of the divine. And what is this higher self? What is this higher ego? We don't know. how is it connected to the collective? Because from the perspective of Vedanta, there's this is the summation of the collective consciousness. So what would that be unsolvable problem, for the collective consciousness? When I'm sitting in this individual level, then I'm doing all the mathematics, I can't solve. But imagine having these 12 minds as a collectively combined, but it's not just about 12. But then when this individuality left behind and we are connected, hooked in the sense, merged into that collective oceanic consciousness, then maybe many of these things are more likely to happen than to be skeptical about. But we have to be open about creating a positive imaginary field for ourselves, to let go and be in there, a safe space for imagination. So that it's not some kind of hallucination I'm going to be taken away from, because there are these very neutral, emotionally neutral type objects you create in imagination and use your emotion very later on when you have developed higher sort of a capacity. Sometimes, yes, some people might fail to make a distinction. That is why you should also have a mentor, to train you on these things. We used to have those things, properly trained.
Yeah, thank you, Acharyaji. That makes perfect sense, because otherwise it almost looked like Srinivasa Ramanujan had it very easy with somebody just coming and giving him all the equations. But this makes perfect sense, because unless he opened himself up to receive it in a certain state, it couldn't have been possible. But for him, it probably felt like it was the goddess manifesting herself in front of him and revealing those things. But ultimately, unless he was in to receive it, it couldn't have happened. Thank you. That makes perfect sense.
So I think now we are at the end of session, and I should say thank you very much, Acharyaji, for accepting our invitation and talking at Center for Indic Studies platform. And this was quite enlightening, and you gave wonderful answers to these fundamental questions. I can only say that we request at Center for Indic Studies to keep coming us at our platform and enlightening us, and keep giving us suggestions on how to take Indian knowledge system ahead. Okay. So thank you very much for today's session.
Thank you so much, guys. Good night.
Good night.